Dying to. I miss it every day. It's such a great agency. I started in 2007 in Iraq, though.
Did a great job.
Hello again. You are stuck with me for another panel. This time we're here to dive into Iran, and I feel very lucky because right now we basically have a mini situation room sitting up on the stage. This is bringing back a lot of memories of that dark windowless room where we spent far too much time and where the Undersecretary is currently spending a lot of time, I imagine. We have representatives from 3 or 4 agencies, in fact, that are deeply involved in Iran policy: Treasury, State, CIA, and the Pentagon. What I'd like to do today is obviously talk about some of the tactical developments that we're seeing, and then take a step back and look at the macro picture of where are we going. Not only how we got here, but what are we actually going to do about it. Let me briefly introduce our panelists and then we'll dive in. To my right is Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Undersecretary Mandelker has also served in senior law enforcement and national security positions at the U.S. Department of Justice and DHS. She previously served as a clerk to the Honorable Clarence Thomas and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan. Ambassador Sherman, it's great to see you. Ambassador Sherman is currently a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group. I was lucky enough to learn from Ambassador Sherman when she was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. She previously served as counselor for the State Department from 1997 to 2001 and as Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs under Secretary of State Warren Christopher. My colleague Jeremy Bash is here as well. He was the Chief of Staff of the CIA and the Pentagon, among many other roles in government, and is currently a Managing Director and founder of Beacon Global Strategies. Thank you so much for being here with us. And just as I did with Senator Murphy, I actually want to start with the intelligence this time around as well, because it's so intrinsic to the development of policy and policy adjustments. Undersecretary Mandelker, you work a lot with intelligence. There's an intelligence bureau within the Treasury Department. And right now, there are a lot of questions about claims that are being made about intelligence. President Trump said several months ago that Iran had violated the JCPOA. I know yesterday we implemented sanctions related to Iran's illicit activities related to WMD. Were there activities that Iran engaged in while the nuclear deal was still in place that were added cause for concern and that led to accelerated the president's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal?
So if I can, just for a moment, I wanted just to take a step back, because I think President Trump, of course, campaigned on what he called the failed Iran deal. And I think that there were a lot of expectations that when he would come into office, he would abandon the deal right away. And he didn't do that, actually. He took an 18-month period to study the situation. There was a lot of effort to work with our E3 partners, for example, to come to an agreement on what we thought a better deal would look like. And in that intervening time, you saw a great deal of continued, highly provocative activity that the Iranians continued to engage in. Whether it's their support for terrorism, of course, historically, Iran has provided Hezbollah hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year for their terrorist activity. And we can't forget that yesterday was the 25-year anniversary of the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Argentina, which resulted in 85 deaths and 300 wounded. And of course, Iran continues to support Hezbollah in many different ways, and certainly did during that intervening time period. Their continued support for the horrific activity that's happening in Syria, where not only was Iran providing funding and militia to support the Assad regime, they were also sending child soldiers to Syria, where they would go and they would fight and they would die. And of course, Iran's ballistic missile program continued unabated. So in that time period, we saw just continued aggressive behavior that was extraordinarily troubling. It should be extraordinarily troubling, I think, for everyone in the room, and I'm sure everyone everyone on this panel. In the meantime, they were able to benefit from a deal that allowed them to profit off of investment from a number of different companies all over the world. And of course, you can't ignore the fact that that kind of revenue is going to go to support Iran's highly destabilizing activity. And it was a big concern for us, for the president. Ultimately, the biggest concern is that they continued on their way, their pathway to a nuclear program, which again is just what we consider to be a fundamental flaw of the deal.
So just to be clear, though, did you see intelligence that Iran specifically violated the JCPOA?
So I can't, of course, talk about intelligence that I have seen, but others in the administration have spoken about what we have seen the Iranians do in connection with its WMD program. And as you mentioned just yesterday, we sanctioned an entire network of Chinese, Belgian companies and Iranian individuals who were responsible for continuing to sell sensitive technology to support Iran's centrifuge program. And of course, if any kind of material like that were to be sold to Iran, it would have to go through the UN Security Council process and the Nuclear Supply Group, and that's not what I believe happened here.
Certainly, and the administration did say several months ago, the DNI, I believe, briefed publicly that Iran had not violated the JCPOA, to the best of my recollection. Undersecretary Sherman, it's almost perfect that we're sitting here today. It's like Foreign Minister Zarif timed his comments just for the Aspen Security Forum. He floated a deal earlier, enhanced nuclear inspections in return for permanent sanctions relief. Now, I don't think he really believes anything is permanent based upon the fact that we levied sanctions and then reimposed them. But if you were currently at the State Department in the role that you played under the previous administration, would you take Foreign Minister Zarif up on this offer? Are conditions right on either side for negotiations right now?
It was interesting. One of the folks who cover this quite closely, Suzanne Maloney, tweeted yesterday, many people have said that Iran won't negotiate, and here is Minister Zarif negotiating in the open. I think that's what this was about yesterday. I think the foreign minister, meeting with journalists, meeting with think tankers, basically proposed that if the United States would lift some of the sanctions, that they would ratify the additional protocol now, which under the terms of the deal doesn't have to be ratified until 2023, when the deal has been implemented and executed over a number of years, and the Congress would terminate nuclear-related sanctions. We've only lifted them. They've now all been reimposed, but the Obama administration had just lifted them, not terminated them. When they were terminated, then the additional protocol would go in place. And the additional protocol, which Iran is voluntarily following at the moment, means that they can never obtain a nuclear weapon. Now, that's not a fail-safe. It is part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Iran could decide, even after making a deal, they're going to leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I don't see it as the be-all and end-all, and I certainly don't see it as the substantial deal that Foreign Minister Zarif laid out yesterday. But I do believe he was beginning to negotiate, and he knows the United States, he knows the United States media, he is a very clever negotiator. I want to say a couple of broad things as well to what Sigal said. The International Atomic Energy Agency has now, I think in 14 reports, said that Iran has been in complete compliance. They have noted and have seen that indeed, as the Foreign Ministry said itself, Iran has now begun to enrich above 3.67% and is allowing their stockpile to go above the 300 kilograms that are allowed. These are reversible steps, and in my view, these are wrong actions on behalf of Iran. They shouldn't do it. They are doing it, in their view, in response to provocations by the United States for reimposing all of the sanctions and for leaving the deal. I appreciate that the president took some time to consider the JCPOA when he came into office, but there was no doubt, I think, in anyone's mind that as soon as people like Mattis, McMaster, even Tillerson left the administration, that the guardrails were off and the president was going to withdraw from the deal. It certainly didn't come as a surprise to me, because throughout the campaign, he said he was going to withdraw from the deal. I think The issue is not whether Iran does horrible things in the world. Iran does horrible things in the world. I have no trust in Iran. Iran has no trust in me or in the United States. The question is, do you want to make sure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon so that it cannot project such power into the Middle East that it would deter our and our allies and partners' actions? And Jeremy will talk more about the security and the defense posture that we need to be in. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who I call the hardliners in Iran, I don't think anyone in Iran is a moderate. People in the past have heard me say people like Rouhani and Zarif are hardliners. The IRGC, the Quds Force, are hardliners. And the hardliners never wanted the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action because they owned the black market. There's a substantial black market in Iran. They owned it. They controlled the economy. Rouhani was trying to pull the economy away from the IRGC. They've now reclaimed a great deal of the economy. And we thought that if we could stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, we could use all of our remaining sanctions, which remained in place, on their terrorist activities, on their weapons and proliferation activities, on their missiles, on their human rights abuses, trying to negotiate getting the rest of the Americans and those missing in Iran back to the United States. We could work with our partners and allies, wouldn't be deterred by Iran having a nuclear weapon, and could work on these terrible, nefarious actions that continued. It's a difference in strategy, and my fundamental question to the administration, then I'll stop, is what is the strategy? I know that it is about maximum pressure, but to what end? And I think the Iranians are trying to calibrate whether President Trump will be reelected or not. If they think he will be reelected, or that there's a good chance that he will be, I think we will continue to see proposals from the Iranians. I think we will continue. I believe that Rand Paul probably met with Foreign Minister Zarif. I hope he did, quite frankly, because there's a long history of senators beginning to try to open doors for diplomacy. And I think in this case, diplomacy is better than war. War, by inadvertence, by miscalculation, by accident, with this escalatory cycle, would be catastrophic and devastating.
And Jeremy, we've talked about the nuclear threat, which is further away than the threats that American citizens, American assets, and allies are facing in the region right now. It feels like Iran is implementing their own maximum pressure campaign. If the nuclear program is their trump card, this is their maximum pressure campaign. How is the Pentagon feeling? What is the appropriate military response? More assets, less, or status quo?
Well, Iran's strategic doctrine for the past 30 years has been to meet pressure with pressure. And in their view, when they don't counteract the pressure, it invites more pressure. And so in that vein, I think you've seen from Iran over the last 2 months a counteracting pressure campaign by them. We've seen a series of military actions. We've seen the mining of tankers. We've seen increased pace of missile and drone attacks into Saudi Arabia. We've seen the targeting of Emirati shipping infrastructure. We've seen the attempted armed boarding of a British vessel. Just yesterday, Iranian forces came upon the amphibious Ready group that the United States had transiting the Straits, led by the USS Boxer, not just with a drone, which we read about in the press, but also with a helicopter, 4 fast boats, and another Iranian-flagged vessel. And of course, on June 20th, the downing with a radar-guided surface-to-air missile of an RQ-4 Global Hawk, the first downing of a U.S.-flagged aircraft in international airspace since the Korean War by an adversary nation. Think about how escalatory Iran has been just in the last 6 weeks. And what is Iran's objective here? Number one, I think, is to test our red lines and the red lines of other countries. I think it's to disperse and raise the costs around the region. I think it's to intimidate allies. Maybe they're trying to raise oil prices and cause havoc in the global economy. But fundamentally, it's what the Supreme Leader said in his May 29th remarks, in which he said, we have been pressured. We have to build up leverage, something to trade away. If we have to end up in a discussion with Washington and we have to trade something away, we need to have something to trade. So they are building up their leverage. A second point, which is that the manner in which I think we responded to the June 20th attack actually reduced our deterrence. Why do I say that? I think had we clearly said that this provocation will be met with a U.S. response at a time and place of our choosing, that would have obfuscated our red line, and I think made less clear exactly how we would respond. Instead, what we said publicly was that DOD did not tell us about civilian casualties until 10 minutes before the strike, and which of course the Iranians assumed to be false, just a cover story. And so they concluded, and I think rightly so, that their actions did not cross a U.S. red line. And so they're going to continue to press and continue to push forward. A third point, as we try to reassert deterrence, as we try to prevent them from accelerating their activities, we could over-rotate. And our exertion of force could be received by them as an escalatory step, and we could be up the escalatory ladder very quickly. And then a fourth and final point is that although I think the United States, I know the United States would eventually win and prevail in a conventional military conflict against Iran, because we have such strategic overmatch, it would be terribly costly. We would struggle to generate the forces into the region necessary to prevail, and I think it would dramatically set back our ability to engage in diplomacy and prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear capability.
So Jeremy, would you keep our military assets in the region where they are right now? Do you think we need more or less?
Well, I think the first objective has to be to understand whether or not there's going to be a diplomatic path. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to have a strong force posture in the region, and I think we have to reassert deterrence. But as I said, we have to be very delicate and careful how we do it so that we don't over-rotate.
So that's the military instrument. Let's turn to the financial instrument. President Trump has implemented a historic sanctions campaign against the Iranians, going above and beyond what President Obama did. From your perspective at the Treasury Department, are sanctions working?
Without a doubt, sanctions are working. Let me just talk about what I see as the two primary objectives of sanctions. One is to disrupt the ability of the Iranian regime and all bad actors around the world that we target to have access to the revenue that they need ultimately to engage in destabilizing and malign behavior. What you're seeing today is historic lows in the amount of oil that the Iranians are able to produce. Some estimate it at under 300,000 barrels per day. The Minister of Energy, in fact, of Iran recently said that he's never seen anything like that. What does that mean at bottom? It means at bottom that Iran isn't going to have the same kind of revenue that they have had historically to build out their nuclear program, to engage, to develop their ballistic missile development program, to support Syria, to support Hezbollah, to support the Houthis. And we're seeing clear evidence of that. Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, recently besieged to the outside world for donations. Why would he have to ask for donations? Because he's not getting the kind of support that he's historically been able to receive from Iran. And by the way, this is the first time we've ever seen the leader of Hezbollah, beg for that kind of funding. In Syria, similarly, you're seeing Iran-backed Syria militia men receiving huge pay cuts. Iran's not able to fund the reconstruction projects that they had promised to the brutal Assad regime. We're seeing time and again, not just in our broad authorities, but that we've been able to disrupt the ability of Iran to continue to gain access to the revenue that they need by going after mass networks of IRGC Quds Force entities that have historically been able to try to manipulate the international financial system to gain access to the revenue that they need. So I think that and of course, we were also seeing Iran's military budget decrease substantially. So I think that part of the pressure campaign is enormously important. Ultimately, we don't want Iran to ever get to a point where we're threatened by an ICBM, by a nuclear program. And the fundamental way to do that is to keep them from having access to the revenue, from the parts that they need to build out that program. And of course, that's what we saw as one of the fundamental flaws of the deal. The other piece of it is to change behavior. President Trump and Secretary Pompeo repeatedly have said that they are open to negotiations. They want to get to a far better deal, that they're willing to sit down at any time. And of course, we're starting to see the Iranians, as Wendy pointed out, make signals that they're willing to come to the negotiating table. Whether those are the right signals is an open question, but I think there's no question that we're seeing this campaign work.
And Ambassador Sherman, there are some clear winners in this scenario right now, and it's not us. Who benefits from this state of play? And should President Trump be phoning a friend in any of these capitals and trying to get them to exert leverage over Iran to come back to the negotiating table?
So I'll answer your question in a minute. Listening to Sigal, and I have tremendous respect for the work that you do and for that job that you have, which is a really tough one. I know it was tough in our administration. It's not the easiest thing to do to use all these financial tools to make these things happen. You really have to run around the world and enforce them. It's not enough just to do the sanction. You have to have a team go out and get people to do them. So I have great respect for the work you do. But we know a few things about sanctions. Sanctions rarely, if ever, stop bad behavior. When the Europeans began negotiating with Iran in the early 2000s, Iran had 164 centrifuges spinning. Centrifuges are the mechanism that can turn enriched uranium into highly enriched uranium, which is the material that you need in one of the ways for material inside of a nuclear weapon. By the time that we got to very serious negotiations in 2013, with unbelievable both unilateral and multilateral sanctions against Iran, where we had a fundamental reduction in their financial assets, they had 19,000 centrifuges. So sanctions did compel Iran to the negotiating table, and they may compel Iran to the negotiating table in this instance, but they did not fundamentally stop bad behavior. And one of the tricky parts here is to make sure that as you are putting the pressure on them to try to take away the financial assets to get them back to the negotiating table, that you are not shifting the balance to trying to stop other bad behavior, legitimately malign and bad behavior, at the cost of them obtaining a nuclear weapon. Because all of that bad behavior does not begin to match the deterrent power of Iran having a nuclear weapon. So that's the balance here that I think is very tricky and not clear to me that the administration understands that leverage balance and the need to ensure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. Now, back to your question.
Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Should we be working with the winners?
I would say Russia and China are currently winners because the Europeans have basically been dissed by the United States in this deal, tried to stay in the deal, tried to keep it going, creating a special purpose vehicle for barter arrangements, particularly around humanitarian goods. And it does break my heart that there haven't been any waivers from Treasury on the humanitarian side, because I think Iranian citizens are hurting badly. But I think that as a result, Russia is playing the role it played in Syria, which is, I can solve this problem, I can take charge, and the Europeans who feel like they can't rely on us are turning more and more towards China. So I think Russia and China are winners in this operation. I think that the other winner in this operation, quite frankly, is the IRGC and the Quds Force. The hardliners are in ascendancy in the politics of Iran. I think the chances of Rouhani, who is a hardliner as opposed to a hardliner, being reelected in 2021 is pretty dismal. And I think that the oppression, which is always present and quite rigorous in Iran, will be worse in the years ahead.
Sam, but just can I jump in here? I mean, just a little bit to play devil's advocate, I think Sigal and her team have been so effective at trying to wring out any ability of Iran to gain revenues from their energy exports. It seems like what the strategy is, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, is is that we are also trying to build up leverage so that if the Iranians do come to the negotiating table, we have something to trade away. It's kind of basic. And I would think that that's exactly what we would want. Now, the question is, in ending the waivers, did we push it too hard, trigger an escalatory cycle that could lead inadvertently to a military conflict? That, I think, is kind of the nub of the issue. And I think that's sort of what's important to discuss.
And we'll come back to that. We'll come back to Instex.
Can I ask Sigal a moment to that? And I know she wants to talk about the humanitarian waivers. But coming up by August 1st, you can make some news here. You have to make a decision about the nuclear waivers. And the nuclear waivers were waivers that allowed Iran to import some things to make some of the changes that came out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. You have to make a decision, the administration has to make a decision about whether they continue or not. If they don't continue, I think we will see this escalatory ladder escalate significantly.
So I'm not going to make any news.
I tried for all the reporters out here.
But I am going to say, look, I think the IRGC are the big losers here. I think the IRGC Quds Force are the big losers here. I started out by saying that our massive pressure campaign has resulted in less revenue going to Iran's military. That is a significant achievement because ultimately it's the IRGC, it's the Quds Force, it's the Madafal, all of those entities that are posing an incredibly destabilizing presence in the region. They're threatening our great ally, Israel. And look, after the JCPOA, what did the Obama administration do to curb that kind of behavior? Nothing. It's really the huge.
I don't think that's quite accurate. So let's
okay.
We'll let others respond to that.
Let me just say, right? Again, bad actors need money to do bad things. That is why we have this massive sanctions regime, because we know Iran is threatening our great partner, Israel, because we know that they're supporting a regime in Syria that is using chemical weapons against its own people because of the crisis that we see in Yemen. All of that material, because they're supporting Hezbollah, the great terrorist organization Hezbollah that's responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and many more. But throughout this deal, the time period of this deal, we continue to see the Iranians engaged, and thankfully mostly thwarted, terrorist plots all over Europe. And every time we apply that pressure, that crunch on them, we deny them the ability to get access to that kind of revenue, we make the world a safer place. That's number one. Number two, I think we just have a fundamental disagreement about what Iran would have done when the sunset clauses expired, right? They would have been during this long time period where they would have had a great amount of access to revenue that would have enabled them to support and build out their WMD program. That's not happening now, and I think any deal the United States negotiates in the future needs to prevent that piece from happening. I can address the humanitarian piece. So,
can I just add one more
yes.
question, just in the interest of time? I'm going to give you, if you could address both, then we'll go down the line one more time. There's been a lot of focus on Instex, on the settlement mechanism, and the Europeans pushing for us to allow them to use this measure. What concerns does Treasury have about this particular mechanism? Because from the outside, it looks like, why wouldn't you let them proceed with this?
So, and I've spoken about this publicly. I wrote an op-ed about it. I sent a letter to the head of Instex about this. I want to say, first and foremost, all of our general licenses that permit humanitarian aid to go to the Iranians continue to exist. And we've been very clear that we want humanitarian aid to go to Iran. The biggest barrier to that, to humanitarian aid getting to the Iranian people, is the Iranian regime. If they would stop spending all this money on their WMD program, if they would stop spending all this money on Hezbollah and instead focus on their economy, the Iranian people would be much, much better off. That's number one. That's just a fundamental piece. The keys to helping the Iranian people rest in the hands of the Iranian regime. There's no question about that. When it comes to Instex, so Instex is a special purpose vehicle arrangement that the E3 agreed to with the Iranians. And when they made the announcement to agree to this Instex, the E3 announced that it was going to operate under the highest anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing standards. The fundamental problem for the E3 is that there are no anti-money laundering standards in Iran. They don't exist. So 3 years ago, at the time of the JCPOA, Iran agreed to implement an action plan under the Financial Action Task Force, whereby they would agree to take 10 very significant steps to have an anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regime in Iran. And they just utterly failed at that. Why have they failed at that? Well, you only need to listen to members of the regime to understand why. It's because they feel that if they have an AML system in place, it's going to be what they called a so-called sanction on themselves, right? You can't tell the largest state sponsor of terror to stop funding terrorism if that's just their fundamental
So your concern
objective.
with Instex is related to the AML and CFT concerns.
There's that piece of it, and then the other piece of it, which is also really important that the Europeans have to understand, is that on the other side of the Instex, on the Iranian side of the Instex negotiations, is the Central Bank of Iran. The Central Bank of Iran systematically has engaged in funneling money to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Quds Force and to other terrorist organizations. And we've exposed that many times over the last year. In fact, not too long ago, we sanctioned the then governor of the Central Bank of Iran for being involved in a huge scheme to send money out to the Quds Force, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and we've done it a number of other times. So it's just a problem for the Europeans, right? How do you negotiate? How do you develop a trade vehicle when the people that you're dealing with on the other side of the vehicle don't understand what it means to have anti-money laundering controls?
Ambassador Sherman, would you like to respond? And then Jeremy, last question for you on whether it's possible to build military coalitions in the Strait right now.
I think the only response I would give to what Sigal just went through is part of my concern very broadly is how we treat and how we work with our allies and partners. And Europe has always been the most reliable, the most important partner to the United States. We are stronger economically, we're stronger in terms of security, we are stronger in terms of our own prosperity and our values when we work with Europe. And so when our European partners want to try to find a way forward to preserve the deal, to continue to talk about the issues of concern about malign behavior, when we want Israel security to be protected, and we want everyone to be on that page with us, to really say that what Europe is trying to do to create this special purpose vehicle with all of the concerns about the corruption in Iran, all of which is real, I just feel like we have turned our back on Europe at a time when we need Europe, we need NATO, we need the transatlantic alliance to not only counter what Iran is doing, but what China is doing, to have a bulwark against Russia, to strengthen that alliance so that we have the economic security we need into the future. So there's a broader strategic concept here that I think gets a very much trees lost in the forest issue.
If I can just address it for 1 second. So I know that there's a narrative that we're not working with our European colleagues. It's just wrong, right? We see the threat in Iran very similarly to our European colleagues. And in fact, we have worked very closely with our European colleagues on countering that kind of malign behavior. In fact, over the last year, over the last year and a half, all of the E3 countries have agreed, for example, to deny landing rights to Mahan Air, which is one of Iran's major international airlines that we view as also an arm of the Quds Force. That's just one example of the many ways that we have, in fact, worked with our European colleagues, and we're going to continue to do so. Those are extraordinarily important partnerships with us. For us, again, we see the JCPOA differently, but there's a wide range of activity countering Iran that we're able to work very productively with, and that alliance continues to be very strong and will continue to in the future.
As we'll hear later from Ambassador Jeffrey, there are some 80 countries in the anti-ISIS coalition. And even if you accept the fact that we're going to have a lot of the capability and that others are going to be there more for symbolism, perhaps for some niche capabilities, that is an impressive show of force. And I do think that what we need to create in the Arabian Gulf is a force posture that at least includes as many countries as possible. Many countries beyond the Gulf, Sunni Arab countries, have a stake in the commerce that flows through the Straits, have a stake in the energy flow and the flow of other goods and services in that area. And I think it would be redound to our benefit if we can get as strong and as large of a coalition to constrain principally Iran's activities to stop to stop that commerce and to allow the free flow of commerce in that area.
Thanks, Sherman. And do we have time for questions? Let's do one question, so make it a good one. Yeah. No pressure.
Iran offered to help us with in Afghanistan, and the Bush administration refused the help. Was that an opening that potentially might have helped us? And what do you all think of that closing that door?
Wendy?
I can't speak to the judgments that the Bush administration made. What I can say is there have been other times in Afghanistan, in Iraq, which Jeremy probably knows quite well, where there have been relationships and discussions to protect troops, to make sure that militias did not attack our troops when our interests aligned. I think there are always security situations where even with adversaries, you might find a sliver of a common cause. But I think regardless, we would all agree, all four of us on this stage, that Iran is a serious issue, that Iran's malign activity in the region needs to stop. We would all agree on this platform that Iran should not obtain a nuclear weapon. We would all agree on this platform that the Iranian people deserve their human rights and a better life, and that the corruption of the Iranian system really takes away opportunities for them. The debate we're having is how you get there, how you achieve those objectives, and of course, the additional objective making sure that Israel, the only democracy in the region, is protected and their security ensured, and that we build our alliance with our partners around the world to achieve these objectives. So what we have up here is a difference in strategy, and for me, the Trump administration is too much about tactics and not enough about strategy, and not enough about seeing the entire landscape and the interaction of all these problems. Issues are sui generis, but the same kinds of tactics and pressure, even though there are many sanctions on North Korea, the expectations of North Korea are quite different, and the approach is quite different. And so it does lead some of us to feel like if it was something done by the Obama administration, it's no good for the Trump administration. I know that's too reductionist, and life is more complicated than that. But I think what's important for everybody here to understand is we all seek the same thing. We just believe there's a different way and a more permanent way and a better way to get there.
Thank you all so much for joining me.
We have another great panel coming on the stage now. We are just resetting the stage. I did hear a couple of cell phones go off, so please check your pocket, check your purse, make sure you have your phone on silent. I know you don't want that to go off in the middle of a session.